Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or on Twitter at STS_news. I would love to hear from you. Hype. Hype. What happened? I expected so much more from you. Until a few months ago, when air started going out of our current technology bubble, we were living in a golden age of hype. There was some truly, truly remarkable, I would argue beautiful hype going on, especially about things like AI and cloud computing and like crypto. But now there's been a shift, and a lot of so-called tech companies have lost a bunch of stock value. Netflix is down nearly 70% from its heights, and e-commerce company Shopify is down over 70%, and they are not alone. Investors are starting to request that companies be profitable, and startup leaders are like, egad, they want us to be profitable? What are they going to ask from us next? That we have a sustainable business model? Holy smokes! Yes, it's hard times in Hypeland. Hard times indeed. And I never realized that it would be this extraordinarily deeply satisfying to see. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's not kid ourselves here. There's still plenty of technology hype around, and it will continue to be with us. Thus, sadly, we must continue to try to understand it better. And one pleasurable entry in this understanding hype genre is a book by science journalist and STS PhD student Gemma Milne. It's called Smoke and Mirrors: How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It. The book examines a series of areas in science and technology, from artificial intelligence to fusion power to cures for cancer, and the outlandish claims made about their potentials. We also talk about ways in which people can learn to see through hype and have more realistic perceptions. I had a lot of fun talking to Gemma. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Get excited. Gemma, thanks so much for talking to me today.
No worries. I'm excited to be here, Lee.
So, Smoke and Mirrors is a neat book, and it covers a subject near and dear to my heart. So, when you were talking, when you were out there promoting it and talking about it with strangers, what did you tell them it's about, and what were you up to with it?
Sure. Well, it's about hype, right? So it's about narratives and kind of promises and idealism that you hear about in predominantly in the science and technology space, which is the area that I'm most interested in. It's also it's also a book that has 9 chapters, and they each are on a different area of science and tech. So some people say to me, "Oh, I thought it was going to be all about hype and kind of theory of hype," but I found it was actually kind of had these in-depth, almost like long read articles about different areas of
Yeah.
science and tech. And some people love that part of it, and some people love more the theory of hype stuff. But I wanted to kind of strike the balance between the two and not do a sort of academic hype book, but also give something that somebody could, I don't know, start to follow some of those areas of science and tech in the press, read the chapter, and then feel empowered to be able to go on and actually, I don't know, have an opinion on stuff, or read an article and be like, that's that thing that I read about. Because I think a lot of stuff when you're popular science, when you're reading about it, it's very kind of basics. This is how a volcano
Yeah.
works, or this is how a battery works, or whatever. But that doesn't help you understand an article that comes out in the Guardian or the FT or the Wall Street Journal about some recent investment or about a law that's recently come out or
Yeah.
something like that. So I wanted to write something that kind of allowed people to feel a bit more empowered to play a part in kind of what's going on now in science and tech, but also to reflect on the role of hype in society.
Yeah, I think you strike the balance nicely. So how do you you have a pretty simple definition of hype? Like you don't feel like I mean, you didn't overly specify it, which is good, I think. So how do you define it?
Oh goodness. Well, I actually kind of use an analogy, which is why it's called smoke and mirror. So I think about it in terms of magic. So I have this in the book. So if you think about going to a magic show, you walk in, you go into the I don't know the theater, and you are by being there and knowingly, unless you've accidentally walked into a room not realizing it's a magic show, you are consenting to be fooled. So you're saying to the magician, "It's cool for you to try and trick me." And you might try and work out how they're tricking you and kind of work out the sleight of hand, or you might just enjoy the show, but either way, you're consenting. If you're being lied to, you could say that that's non-consensual fooling.
Hmm.
So you're being fooled and you don't realize it's happening. With hype, I think about it as a thing that can result in accidental fooling. So it's a marketing tactic.
Hmm.
It's a thing that's used to capture attention. It's not there for understanding. It's not there to convey information in a really detailed way. It is a tool that is used to capture somebody's attention, stop them in their
Yeah.
tracks. And sometimes that can result in accidental fooling, misunderstanding, misreading. You know, it can, well, as we know with headlines, it can result in people getting the wrong end of the stick,
Yeah.
or actually getting not even just having a little bit wrong, getting the total incorrect, I guess, understanding of a thing. So that's kind of how I think about hype, and it's not about it being. I didn't want to write about it and say this is a terrible thing. We need to banish it because it's
Yeah.
kind of not possible.
Yeah.
But more try and understand the mechanics of it and how it works, the history of it, and kind of what it looks like nowadays.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember, I don't think I saw you ever seen Harry Frankfurt's definition of bullshit before?
Oh, I think I read about this in Carl and Jevon's book. Was it called Calling Bullshit? I think they write about
Ah,
it. But remind
okay.
me of.
Yeah, no, I mean,
We also interviewed them for Radical Science, and we were talking about it.
yeah, I mean, he has it as a kind of, it's not lying, it's not the truth, it's kind of speech meant to persuade and move. So
That's it.
sometimes it can line up with the truth, and sometimes it's totally false, but it's really speech meant to move you more than do either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's when you realize that hype is there simply to get you to stop in your tracks. Um, you it, what it forces you to do is to then kind of look a bit further, and it allows you to kind of get rid of the illusion,
Yeah.
right? So it's the thing about magic is it completely falls down when the illusion is broken, and it's the same with hype. When you know that it's an illusion, whether it's an illusion that's to make you feel super excited, and that's fair enough because the thing is exciting,
Yeah.
or not. The point is that when you can kind of get past that barrier, you can then start to go, okay, what are they actually saying? What does this actually mean? And what are the actual implications of this? Or how do I feel about this beyond the emotion that they are trying to target by using particular words or images or so on and so forth? So, it sounds like a very simple and obvious thing to say.
Yeah.
Um, but the fact that it hype propagates suggests to me that that obviousness is not something that we remember on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in. Um so how'd you start working on this book? I mean, you're a doctoral researcher now. Did you identify as kind of science journalist before that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the even thinking about doing a PhD was after the book was already out, so that wasn't wasn't originally part of the plan. That was more a COVID thing. Oh, I finally have time. Let's go do a PhD. But and also wanting to build on the topics of the book. But yeah, it came from I don't know, a long career of having various different playing different roles in the hype journey, shall we
Mm-hmm.
say. So, I worked in advertising, which is, of course, where hype is created. That is, the business of hype is
Mm-hmm.
advertising, and for good and for bad, mainly for bad. But so it was a really interesting, I guess, schooling in what it means to try and capture attention. And I found that before I did that, I did a maths degree and I was very interested in science and tech, but I thought let's go and give this advertising thing a go because I also have sort of art side that I wanted to try out. But when I was there, it made me think a lot about how science is communicated, and I was basically trying to think of how science could kind of learn from the world of advertising in order to, get messages out in a more interesting
Yeah.
way. So, I remember going to like a science communication meetup that was in London, and they were all like, "Why are you here? You work in advertising." I'm like, "I'm literally paid to communicate things like that. That is like my actual job.
Yeah.
Like, no offense to some of you, but you just do this on the side. Like, this is a literal entire industry.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure there must be some, crossover here." So I found it quite funny that people weren't kind of trying to take advertising 101 and use it for good, quote
Yeah.
unquote. So, know your audience, what's the single message, all that sort of stuff. So I kind of got interested in science communication in that respect. And then, as with a lot of people that kind of go into science communication, they become a little bit cynical, probably very cynical about
Yeah.
the very scientism element of a lot of science communication out there, and then so on and so forth. But worked in advertising, ended up in a job that I was doing like corporate innovation stuff. So I was speaking to a lot of startups.
Mm.
So obviously I was hearing all their pitches and going to conferences. And if you've been to tech conference, which I'm sure you've been to many, Lee, you know what it's like with these kind of, 10 seconds elevator pitch to
Yeah.
sell us your SaaS tool for tracking tractors or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I was kind of like in that world and was reflecting on this, like, what is this hype thing? What this has so much power, but at the same time I work in an industry that creates it. How do I feel about that?
Mm.
Um, I ended up getting made redundant. They shut the innovation team, very innovative move by the big company, and I thought, let's give this freelance
Mm.
journalism thing a go. And then obviously when you're a journalist, you're receiving pitches all the time, and your job is literally to try and see through hype,
Yeah.
but not to just kind of put your hand up and say that's rubbish, I'm not even going to listen to you because you've used hype to capture my attention, but rather to try and dive that little bit deeper.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, I guess the book came from a long time of thinking about my own role, responsibility, complicity in hype, and both as a journalist writing about companies and science and tech, but also in the advertising space, but also reflecting on my frustration with people not understanding things properly, particularly when it came to deep tech and science, which is kind of my area of interest. So, it started off being this kind of angry book, but the more I thought about it, it was like, actually, I think there's a bit more to this than just being like, don't read the Daily Mail.
Yeah.
But more kind of, it's quite, hype is very interesting as a kind of, I don't know, invisible hand or whatever you want to
Mm-hmm.
call it.
So your book examines 9 areas, as you said. They are food, cancer cures, batteries, fusion energy, commercializing space, quantum computing, brain-computer interfaces, AI, and astrobiology. Which one of those areas did you dive into first when you were starting to work on the book?
It was quantum computing was my
Oh
first one.
man.
Yeah, I mean, I just happened to be interested in it. I was covering that in my writing at the
Mm-hmm.
time. I'd been commissioned to write a few pieces about quantum computing. I went to a quantum computing startup conference and didn't understand half the things anyone was
Did they
saying. I don't
understand
think
it?
anybody. No, see, that's the thing. It was really interesting. It was like the person presenting understood it, but the person who was on after wouldn't understand what the person before was
Yeah.
saying. It was very like siloed. It was a great conference. It was very enlightening from a sort of sociological
Yeah.
perspective. But anyway, so yeah, I was already writing about that anyway. And when the sort of idea for the book came up, and I was matched with an agent and so on and so forth. Well, you'll know this with nonfiction writing. You write a proposal, and it's that kind of delicate balance between, you don't want to spend tons of time doing tons of research to do a proposal for it to then be
Yeah.
rejected. But equally, you also have to write something good enough to get a book deal. So just because I already had written on quantum computing, it was kind of the quote unquote easier one to start with. Also, I figured if I could get a mainstream publisher to buy a book that has a sample chapter on quantum computing, I'm pretty sure they could buy
Yeah,
anything
yeah, yeah,
by
yeah.
me. But also quantum computing, as you know, is has a really interesting recent history with hype.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit, and it's sort of everybody wants to know what it is, but equally doesn't want to go into huge depth trying to understand quantum mechanics. So
Right.
I figured the timing was good, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, I love that chapter. Quantum's always one of my kind of favorite go-to examples of hype, and I can't tell you how many bad undergraduate student papers I've had to read on quantum over the years. I mean, it's
Oh
just
no.
torture. So maybe why don't we say a bit more? Why don't I mean say in your kind of the simplest version you want to play with, like what quantum is, and why do you think it's been surrounded by hype for so long? Because I feel like it's at least 10, maybe more like 20 years at this point. It just kind of remains a bubble.
Yeah, I think my theory on why it's kind of why it's got a lot of hype about it is it's both got this aura of being really difficult to explain and understand, which arguably it
Yeah.
is. It is, if you go into the real depths of it, it is difficult. In the same way that understanding how any computer works
Right.
or how a car works or anything is very
Yeah.
difficult when you go into the depths of the detail. But quantum mechanics, of course, particularly in a popular science context, has this aura of being this like super difficult thing and all that jazz.
Yeah.
And I think people get caught up with it being so difficult to explain, but it's also got this really compelling, simple promise, hyped up
Yeah.
promise around being, super fast computing, which is very easy to understand. And particularly a lot of the narratives around this idea that you can, do multiple things at once at the same time, which is an incorrect understanding of quantum computing, but that's a lot of time what's written about it. And when I first started writing about it, I'm guilty for also jumping onto that, that hype narrative, because it is an easy way, quote unquote, of explaining quantum computing. This idea that a computer does things in a linear fashion, one after the other, but a quantum computer can take multiple things and do it all at once. That's a very simple, compelling idea, particularly when you start saying, AI needs more computing power in order to do things. So if we pair it with quantum computing, then we
The
can
singularity
have
is
awesome
just on the
AI.
horizon. I know.
Right. So it's like both extremely complicated, so people don't feel empowered enough to question it. But at the same time, it's got these very simple, compelling ideas, which are really exciting, particularly when you pair them with other hyped up technologies like AI. But alongside that, there's also been, like you said about that conference, nobody understood what was going on within the sector. It's sometimes difficult to really assess things properly. So when I was interviewing people for the chapter, I interviewed Scott Aronson, who's one of the main people, sort of quantum computing celebrities, for lack of a better word. Super obviously knowledgeable in the space, has been in it for years and years and years. We had a great interview. He was really, really helpful. But even when I said to him, what startups should I be paying attention to and which ones shouldn't I? He was like, frankly, I find it difficult to assess this because they're all doing completely different things. It's all so specific and you can't possibly keep on top of everything. So you've got this problem where people within the sector are all trying to sell stuff,
Right.
Particularly from the startup space, but even the experts are finding it difficult to assess. So it's quite easy to capture attention if you manage to have a cool, interesting narrative. But it takes perhaps quite a while to for things to be debunked, and we saw that with D-Wave. That's the kind of famous example in the quantum computing space. A company which is still going nowadays, and I would argue is doing well because of the self-fulfilling prophecy of their hyped up narratives of 10 years ago. But they kind of oversold and kind of didn't correct people when they got it wrong, shall we say, when they were saying about what it is that they were creating with their quantum computers. And it's a difficult one as well, because the other thing that's worth paying attention to is the sort of counting of qubits as well. So again, because there's a difficulty with understanding and tracking the field, this sort of pseudo measurement of progress has
Mm-hmm.
emerged, which is like, how many qubits does the computer have? And so you'll see the press releases like, we've made it to like 50 qubits, or we've made it to 100 qubits, or so on and so forth. And that is not enough. It doesn't tell you enough about how good the quantum computer is. And that's what D-Wave did. They were like, we've got, over 1,000 qubits years ago. And folk were like, how's that possible?
Yeah.
But, they managed to get a lot of investment as a result. They did this sort of press release train where they were counting the qubits, and it was a thing to follow. It was almost gamified.
Yeah.
So, again, it's these sort of oversimplified ideas that people don't feel confident enough to question. But at the same time, it's a hypey area, and people want to invest. And D-Wave got a lot of investment.
Yeah.
As a result. So.
And they're still here as a result, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, they now have technology which is useful for some applications.
Yeah.
And I think as well, what's happened in the sector is that it's become very, like, the promise of what businesses can get from it, in recent times has been a real part of the narrative. So it's not just been this kind of basic science, nerdy area. It's now, how can you do amazing AI, right? That's the thing. It's like, how can you solve these optimization problems? How can you, do more difficult computation? And of course, not just huge companies like Google, or not a company, NASA,
Mm-hmm.
are wanting to invest in those kind of technologies because it is genuinely useful to some degree of what they're trying to do. But you're then capturing smaller businesses who arguably don't necessarily have the in-house talent to properly critique it.
Yeah.
but they understand, well, I should be doing stuff with AI,
Right.
so I should probably look into this area as well. So it's a difficult one, but I think, D-Wave got the investment and they end up building something good as a result, and it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Not an ethical one, though, in my opinion.
Is one winner of quantum computing just basic science? I mean, are scientists happy with this hype?
Yeah, I mean, this was part of the argument I made in the chapter. I was sort of saying, you've got this sort of delicate point that we're in where, yes, basic science has massively, I guess, you benefited from this hype because you've got a lot of people investing in labs. You've got people like Microsoft funding and creating entire swathes of labs across different universities. Sometimes buying labs and bringing them in-house, which is, a separate issue, but still the money's there, and there's a lot of good research being funded by hype, arguably. Where I guess I worry is, it's the same thing as usual. When's the bubble going to burst, right? When is the sort of the people who are investing in this going to want the return? Because as we all know, basic science doesn't always give you what it is you're looking for from an application perspective, but it's also super, super slow.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing with quantum computing, is that there's many things that are arguably not possible to do. Like, we can't get rid of all noise, for instance. Like, that's sort of the current understanding. But you've got a lot of idealistic people funding it, hoping that we'll be able to create these, all singing, all dancing computers that can do amazing things with AI or whatever else down the line. So I think it's this kind of people within the basic science community, within quantum computing, were part of creation of hype over the years. They've been lobbying for, more investment and more interest and more business interest, going, this is a thing that can be applied for business, because they know that that's what gets grant approvals accepted, right? So there's this kind of complicity in creating these hype bubbles, but then now they're sort of going, hang on, that's not actually really what it does.
Right.
What do we do now? And so there's a sort of, that whole thing with the AI sort of hype cycles and the AI winters. It's like, are we going to have a quantum computing winter at some point? That's kind of my open question that I ask in the book. I think that we will. So yes and no, they're benefiting from current investment, but long term, who knows?
Yeah. I really liked your chapter on food, because that wouldn't be like, if I was going to list like the hyped science and technology issues, it would not be on my initial list, but it was like really clear, like all the examples you gave of like multiple hyped technologies around it. So why do you think food is like why was it for you like a fun example to play with in the book to bring it in?
Well, I was thinking about frankly, it was just what am I interested
Yeah,
in, and I'm very interested in the agri-food tech
yeah.
sector, and agri-food tech startups. I've been to quite a few conferences at the time, which were actually really interesting and brilliant and
Hmm.
fascinating in many ways. That had a lot of the sort of agri-food tech innovation there, and I felt that it was also this really intriguing sector where um, I felt out of most of the areas that I covered, and basically that each chapter is basically these are all the things that I covered as a
Hmm.
journalist. Um, Out of all of them, I felt that it was the one that was most full of really nice, well-meaning
Oh yeah,
people,
yeah.
even more so than cancer.
Hmm.
Like this, I think people who a lot of people who come from farming
Hmm.
backgrounds and are then kind of learning about startups and innovation and technology, they're sort of, I don't want to say they're idealistic because I think that's obviously too grand a statement, but I think that um there's a real
Hmm.
energy in that sector around genuinely trying to make things
Yeah,
better from a climate perspective, from a sustainability in terms of feeding people
yeah,
perspective, from a health perspective, from a treating farmers in non-Western countries better perspective, like all that
yeah.
sort of stuff. So there's a lot of really great stuff in there, but at the same time, there's also a lot of, like, as there is in many of these kind of idealistic places, like band-aid over a gaping wound
Yeah.
ideas. And so things like vertical farming, for instance, is one that was one of my biggest bugbears, because it was often sold with this very kind of save the world
Hmm.
perspective, like we're killing the soil and we're killing the planet, so let's like grow lettuce in a shipping container and charge loads of money for it. It just doesn't really compute, but it's sold in this way. And so for me, it felt like a really intriguing place where there was loads of hype, but it was almost like allowed because people were going, "We know you're
Yeah,
trying,"
yeah.
and and so this kind of like "we can save the
Hmm.
world" thing was very inherent to those kind of spaces that I was in, and there was an element of truth in it too with the sort of things they're working on, because they are working on trying to feed people, which of course is um you know
Important.
uh a thing that's, yeah, it's important. Yeah, that's a good word for it. I was trying to say something more intelligent, but yeah, it's just important. um but I do think that there is a lot of hype around those technologies and real interest. So for instance, like lab grown meat is
Yeah.
an area that gets tons of coverage in the science and tech and mainstream press, much like AI, much like space. It's got that same sort of bombastic, this is going to be the next big
Yeah.
thing, and it's also going to save the
Hmm.
world. So that was kind of why I was interested. But I also felt it was something that I was kind of shocked when I went to my first like farming tech conference, um, how little I'd actually thought about where my food came from.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean that was obviously, there's, I think in recent years there's been a lot more focus on, particularly from this climate and sustainability perspective. Veganism is obviously a huge thing.
Hmm.
There's a lot of documentaries and focus on not eating fish, for
Hmm.
instance, or I think Seaspiracy was that recent one on Netflix. So there's a lot of conversation about it, but I felt, I was like, why aren't we thinking about our food so much? Why is it not covered in
Hmm.
the way that other things are, particularly from a science and tech perspective? Things like chemical fertilizers and stuff. Why is that not getting the same coverage as other areas of
Yeah.
science that arguably are not really as important for people's day-to-day lives? So it was a sort of challenge to try and write about food being such a huge topic, but at the same time I want to try and capture this, tech will save the world, tech will feed us um, narrative that's really prevalent in these kind of startup-y tech science food spaces.
Yeah, one of the themes I really liked in that chapter, is something that applies to other areas of life too. But I mean, part of what you're looking at with these multiple startups and different technology ideas is this kind of we've made food so cheap, and and that kind of like shapes the way we consume food in a lot of ways. And there's this fantasy that we're just going to be able to like through technological change, like keep that boat going
Yeah.
in that way.
Yeah.
And like, you know, in reality, we, as you say in the book, like we actually just need to pay more for food.
Mm.
But that's like
Mm.
that's a harder message to sell than like, oh, there's some other technology gonna come along to like save us from what
Yeah.
we've built, right?
Yeah, I mean, the tech will save us narrative is the sort of getting you off the hook
Yeah,
narrative. It's a nicer one to want to engage in, and it's one that doesn't make you feel guilty.
yeah,
Which a lot of the coverage around food does make people feel guilty, particularly meat eaters. When you're reading about, you shouldn't be eating meat, it's kind of like, well, I really like mince and bolognese and all
yeah, yeah,
does that mean I can't have that? I don't like corn's a bit weird, I don't want to eat that. So it's a
right,
guilt thing. And it's the same with, oh, don't buy from Tesco, like go to a local
yeah,
farmers market. And you're like, I've got my kids to take to school and I've got to like get to my job. Like I only have time to go to one supermarket. I don't have time to go to the butcher and then the
mhm,
fishmonger. Well, you're not eating fish or meat anymore. I don't have time to go to the
right,
farmers
right,
market to just get vegetables. And then go, to the supermarket just for my essentials, all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of kind of difficult truths, I
yeah,
suppose, that it's the only way forward, frankly, as we're hearing in a lot now, more so than we did in years gone by. Um, so it's very tantalizing when you then have some Silicon Valley person swoop in and go, yeah, everything's messed up when it comes to the food sector, but don't worry, we've got a solution
yeah,
here that's going to allow us to keep doing what we're doing, but do it in a sustainable, healthy, cost-effective, ethical, although it's not a lot of time it's not
yeah,
way. So um, it's a difficult one because it's really pulling on people's um emotions. It's not just like, oh, I'm interested in science tech, I'm interested in food, I'm gonna
right,
read this article. It's like, no, people are searching for answers as to how to live their day-to-day lives, what to buy when they're standing in the supermarket aisle. Should I buy Oatly, even though it's funded by this horrific
yeah, yeah,
private equity group, but it's better than like milk and they don't have Alpro today? So is it better to go with normal milk or is it better to go with Oatly funding this horrible company? That people are asking those
yeah.
questions. So it's tantalizing when you hear these tech will save us narratives.
The cancer chapter, I think, is another one that kind of really puts its finger on a spot where, I mean, it really kind of touches us existentially, you know, because this is such a, you know, it's such an issue that hits home for many of us as individuals, if not as
Mm.
cancer survivors, then as people who have loved ones who die from it. So I think you, you know, you cover so many examples of hyped, you know, supposed cures that later turned out to be hot air in that chapter. And I also thought you did a really nice job looking at how kind of pharmaceutical companies juke the stats to make their seem like their treatments are just way more effective than they are. But one of the things I liked about in that chapter is you brought out like the costs of hype in different ways. So I thought we might use, you know, that in other. I mean, use whatever technologies or cases you want to. But like, what are the costs of hype for us as just like citizens and, you know, as consumers and stuff?
Sure. Well, specific to that chapter, I kind of argue that, in a bit of a roundabout way, I argue that the cost of hype with respect to cancer therapeutics is we're actually not getting good
Yeah,
therapeutics. And that's because we are essentially by propping up the same methods, the same regulatory ways of doing things, um, and cheering on and being excited by arguably very small
yeah,
steps. We're not there isn't the incentive for those who are developing various different therapies to frankly just try harder and
hmm,
do things differently and try not create incremental therapies that give one person who can afford it an extra two
yeah,
months, but instead go, actually, we need to try a different way of discovering, whatever new methods of doing things
hmm,
are, or taking different approaches and so on and so forth. So there's many different, I guess, costs of hype, and with that, it's this sort of you're actually halting
yeah.
progress of a sort by holding up the status quo and not kind of questioning it. But there's many. It's kind of, for me, a lot. That's really the worst thing about hype. It's this idea that by getting excited and cheering on, what we think of as innovative, awesome science and tech that's changing the
Yeah.
world. Ironically, because of that, we're not getting the science and tech that really would change the world. Not to sound hypey myself. And so I guess what I mean by that with cancer therapeutics is hype stops us from having difficult conversations, similar to what I'm arguing in the food chapter.
Yep.
But with cancer therapeutics, by saying, "Oh, this company's just released this new therapy that gives people an extra 3 months, and you can only get it on certain insurance, or actually in the UK you can't get it at all because it's not been approved
Right.
by NICE because it's actually not that
Right.
effective. But if you can raise the funds, you can get it." We're not having difficult conversations about, well, actually, is it worth investing in an extra 3 months worth of life?
I know.
If it also means that you're not living very well, that's a very difficult conversation to have, particularly because, one person is going to have direct experience either personally or with a close family member. Other people are going to have experience with themselves or close family members having different, heart condition and going, well, that wasn't funded. Why should cancer get all the attention? And then, of course, you've got people just, fear of death. In a lot of Western societies, death is so taboo. We don't talk
Yeah.
about it. We don't plan for it. It's like, I don't want to write a will just in case.
Yeah.
Don't want to tempt fate, all that sort of thing. So by not cheering on advances in cancer, even if the advance actually isn't that great and is super hypey, what you're also doing is sort of, people read that as, oh, you don't want to cure cancer. Why are you not interested in patients? And of course, that's not the point.
Yeah.
You're going, I want better. I want more. I want people who have the funds and the means and so on and so forth to step up. But it's a difficult thing to do when, of course, you're talking about people's lives.
Yeah.
So that's for me, that's where the sort of real cost of hype, specifically with healthcare in general, but most so with cancer, with it being the thing that gets the most coverage.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, it's even worse over here in the States where, like, the numbers are just, like, completely gross when it comes to how much we spend on end-of-life care here. Because the insurance companies will pay for it. But it's all these, like, really expensive cocktails that, like, as you say, they give us, sometimes mere couple more weeks. And we're spending, like, hundreds and thousands of dollars on that, a couple more weeks. It's just,
and it could be a couple more weeks in a lot of pain.
Right.
And for some people, that's what they want. And fair play,
Right.
But for others, that isn't worth the cost.
Right.
And what I found, I guess, quite the example that people tend to kind of really go, I hadn't really realized that when it comes to cancer, was about the way that drugs are approved. So it's just like, it's either approved or it's not.
Yeah.
There's no like traffic light system with like, this is a really effective drug. This is semi-effective. This is not so effective. It's just yes or no. And particularly in the UK, it's kind of interesting because, of course, we have public health here. But because we have public health, we have a body, NICE, I already mentioned it, that decides whether or not something is going to be funded publicly or is not. So you have drugs that in the US, you have literal adverts on your televisions, which I still boggles my mind when I
it's not
that.
Great.
It's just nuts. Saying like, take this drug for lung cancer, and then you go to like the UK and the government literally goes, we're not funding that because it's not effective enough.
Right.
And then you get the Tories running on a campaign promise of going, oh, our NHS is not funding enough of these drugs, so we're going to create a new fund that will fund all the stuff that you can get in the States. And then they create this fund that is so ineffective, so costly, it gets shut down after like 3 years. But they ran on that and they won. That was part of the sort of real campaign when the Tories first came in or switched over from Labour. So it's like, again, this sort of promise and like this thing that's meant to be really good, like we're saving lives, we're doing stuff to do with cancer. It's like you get a pass, you know, if you just talk about cancer. I mean, you see it in biology research. All you have to do is mention cancer in your grant application. You're gonna do a lot better in terms of getting that approved because of that. That's the kind of thing that people want to do, and again, rightly so, understandably so. Blah 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 blah
Yeah.
blah. But yeah, we're just really not having these difficult conversations, like you said, about end of life care in the US and the funding for it. This is a difficult thing to talk about.
Yeah.
And again, the sort of the tech and science titans can swoop in and take advantage of that. Not necessarily deliberately. They're not these evil conspiratorial
Yeah.
people who are reading my book and going, "Aha, let's make the most of
Usually.
it." Well, but at the same time, that is the reality of what's happening.
Yeah. So you covered two energy technologies in the book, batteries and fusion. And one common denominator I see between them in what you write is that beyond being overly optimistic about the individual technologies themselves, people often fail to understand how difficult it might be to bring them into existing energy systems. So, what's the relationship between like hype and simplification in your
Mm,
view?
mm. I think that hype propagates because people are looking for simplicity. I think that it's dealing with complex ideas. Not everyone has time in their day-to-day life to try and understand the entire, supply and production chain of battery technology.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not something people do day to day, for many reasons. But also I think it's, as we know, it's, and we see this in politics, we see this in day-to-day life, it's very difficult to hold conflicting information in your head at the same
Yeah.
time. And with complex systems, that is literally what you have to do. You have to be able to go, if we do this, that's really positive, but also if we do it, it's pretty negative,
Yeah.
and I have to work out how I feel about
Right.
it. So, and to be honest, I wrote this book before the pandemic. It came out in April last year, right? The start of, well, not really the start of the pandemic, the start of how it was covered, at least
Yeah.
when it started getting coverage in the UK and in the US too. But um, I wrote it with this kind of bugbear that people, it's a very general thing, that mainstream media, the way that we kind of, the things that get published and do well in terms of people taking notice of it, tends to be simplified things. Like when I try and pitch really complicated articles, and say, I want the hero of this article to be the system, not some
Yeah.
character, an editor doesn't tend to be interested in. It's really, really annoying. But actually, I think one of the one of the good things about the pandemic, is that this idea of trying to understand complex systems and contextualize complex systems is now a standard part of our media. Like,
Hmm.
you had to be able to write about why we didn't have toilet paper and expose the entire supply chain network of toilet
Yeah.
paper, but also how toilet paper impacts like health systems, and like why teachers can't go to schools is the same reason as we can't have toilet paper.
Yeah.
That sort of challenge, not everybody rose to it in terms of journalism, but a lot of people just had to in order to explain what was going on with the pandemic. So in some sense, I think the problem of hype playing into people's need for
Hmm.
simplicity, I hope, maybe I'm being idealistic here, I hope is slightly reduced as a result of what we've all had to try to come to terms with over the past almost 2 years now. But yeah, hype is a shortcut. It lets you take something really complicated and sort of summarize it into a headline or an emotion. Thinking about like automation, robots are going to steal our jobs. That's a very simple idea
Yeah.
that people get, that people have an emotional reaction to, but actually is a super
Yeah.
complicated, complex area,
Right.
summarized in this one idea. And it's the same with fusion. It's always going to be 50 years away. This kind of butt of the joke thing is a simple idea which has truth in it, but does not by any means give you any door into this super complex system. The same with batteries, this idea of like trying to find the holy grail of batteries that is light, is cheap, lasts long, charges quickly, is actually not the reality of how the battery world
Hmm.
works. And also the idea of looking at the technology itself, like, oh, we found this new chemical. You're not looking at, well, what would happen with factories?
Yeah.
Would factories have to be completely redesigned
Right.
because you've got this new chemical? Or what's it going to do to the price of your whole device the minute the price of the battery changes? That's the whole thing with electric cars. The most expensive part of an electric car is the
Yeah.
battery. So if you can't nail batteries, you're never going to nail electric cars because they're not going to be cheap enough for the market. So I think letting people in and showing, frankly, the majesty of complexity, because I find systems fast. I love systems. And I think if you can try and showcase that that's a much more interesting way of understanding the world, not a more difficult way, then hype, again becomes something that's not desired
hmm
because it doesn't give you that sort of full picture. But again, we all like things to be simple sometimes, so
Yeah.
it plays into that.
The other thing I was thinking about another thing I was thinking about while reading your book is that um, digital technology is kind of a locus of hype today, and you can see it in your chapters because, like, at least three of them, in there's quantum, there's brain computer interfaces, and AI. We can add I mean, we could add other chapters too because they have a lot of digital stuff in them. I just wondered, like, it seems to me like plausible that hype tends to surround young industries where there's lots of change more than older industries. I mean, you don't see like a lot of hype around the coal
Mm.
burning power plant industry or the plumbing industry or the you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, yeah.
I wondered, like, digital technology is, depending on how you count it, it's still young in some ways. Like, especially the app-based one is only 15 years old or something like that. But it's getting older. I mean, people are apparently like choosing to repair their iPhones more often these days because
Mm.
they don't think the new features are worth it. Frankly, like,
Yeah.
this is an old, that I'm holding up my iPhone. This is an aging thing. It is reaching
Yeah.
mature form. So I just wondered if what you think about that and whether you think like maybe some hype around digital technology will kind of tamper off as these things age.
It's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about it in terms of age. I mean, I do think a lot about the difference between digital and non-digital, shall we say, technology, because I sort of specified a lot of my coverage and interest is, some people call it deep tech, which is basically anything that's not
Oh,
digital,
interesting. Uh
sort of
huh.
thing. So I'm specifically interested in stuff that's, it's not necessarily just hardware, but it's stuff that is, um, there's a lot of IP
Yeah.
involved.
It's in
It's
industry.
part of it's part of complex
Yeah.
systems. And whereas digital is not that, although there'll be things like apps for
Yeah.
farmers, which will be part of the agri-food tech industry, to some degree. So I do think a lot about the difference between them. I actually think that the what's happening in deep tech at the moment is there's a lot more interest in it, because it's almost like folk have gone, oh god, it's really hard. I'm kind of getting bored of. You think about the sort of startup-y
Yeah.
space where the entrepreneurs getting excited, right?
Right.
There's a lot more investment and people joining programs and stuff in deep
Hmm.
tech, and I think a lot of that is because they're kind of like, I don't want to say digital's too easy, but it's this sort of thing of like there's tons of people doing it.
Yeah.
It's super
Mm.
congested. It's arguably quite hard to get investment now
Yeah.
because I think people can see through the hype with much easier with
Yeah.
software than they can with something like fusion
Right. Right.
energy.
Right. Right.
um, but so I think we're at an interesting point in non-digital
Mm-hmm.
because it's the sort of convergence of a lot more interest but not a lot of understanding. So and frankly, it's like, I don't want to say we're running out of ideas with digital, but
Well, something like
kind of
that,
are.
though. Yeah. Yeah. It
It's
feels like the low hanging fruit have been picked, and
right,
and like
exactly.
Uber and Lyft and Grubhub and these companies are. There's no road to profitability. It looks like, and even if they are, they're not going to be high
Yeah,
growth industries eventually.
right, exactly. And the thing about deep tech that I also find interesting is the way that how value works.
Yeah.
So if you think about a digital technology, you essentially, the value of the technology all the time is like the number of
Yep.
users. So it's how good your marketing is, frankly.
Right.
Whereas with deep tech, the value is normally inherent in the IP.
Uh-huh.
And you know, I have a lot of opinions about IP. I don't necessarily think we should be protecting certain things, and I don't
Sure.
think the way that IP works is necessarily good for the world. But the reality of deep tech is that the reason things get funded, and not all investors, but investors in deep tech are happy to wait longer for return, is because the value doesn't dissipate in the
Yeah.
same way that it can in digital. So, you know, if a lot of times you don't even need marketing in deep tech, you just need the right
Yep.
connections. You need a meeting. So hype in digital, you need it because you need to be able to essentially capture attention in a bigger way because it's about
Yep.
marketing.
Yep.
Like the value of these companies is how many people use it. It's just not the same in other industries. You don't need people to like really care about plumbing in order to get investment, because if you've got a really good technology
Yeah.
in the plumbing industry and you speak to an investor who understands the plumbing industry and you sell to a really big supplier who is linked up with 60% of the plumbing industry in the US, you don't really need
Yeah.
hype.
And you just made a
you need
gazillion dollars in
yeah, way more money
Yeah.
than in digital. It's huge. So I suppose hype works in different
Yeah.
ways in these spaces. And you know, obviously my book is much more focused on so-called deep
Mm-hmm.
tech, if you want to call it that, because I think it's an interesting moment that I think the sort of strategies that have been used in digital, specifically in the startup space, are coming to deep
Mm-hmm.
tech. So you're starting to get these like, we're the change makers,
Yeah.
we're saving the world, you
Yeah.
know, we're the entrepreneurs, we're the frontier of today, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
In deep tech, in places like AI, I mean that's obviously been going for a long time, but in, you know, look at brain computer interfaces, you've got Musk there, for God's
Mm-hmm.
sake. Look at space. You know, the space industry is not going to Mars or the moon. It's like making satellites,
Yeah.
and it has been for a long time.
Yeah.
But it's got this like exciting, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But in the entrepreneurs of today are that. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's I mean, not so much Musk, not so much, sorry, Zuckerberg. He's not so cool, but Musk. You know, I think it's that kind of vibe that has been in times gone by much more linked to digital technology is very much so now in places like biotech.
Mm-hmm.
And you see it in conferences. You see it in the way that deep tech conferences now are like, have super high production value. They have, you know, speed pitches.
Yeah.
They're really fun to go to,
Mm-hmm.
frankly. You know, they're sponsored by interesting companies. They're not sponsored by pipette companies. They're sponsored by like gin companies. So you know, you get like really great drinks at the after party,
Nice.
as opposed to like getting to speak to some bod about getting your pipette supplied for your lab. You know, so it's I don't know, the culture in deep tech is more similar to that sort of like Silicon Valley-esque thing. Saying all that, I think people are getting a bit bored of the Silicon Valley thing
Yeah.
too. You know, I think you show how out of date you are if you use the language
Yep. Yep.
of Silicon Valley now. So if you're saying like, you know, let's do a hackathon and there's free pizza, you're a bit like, oh, that's a bit 2015, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know,
Cringe.
which sounds harsh, but yeah, exactly. Let's do an elevator pitch, you know, and you're like, oh no, you're new to this, you know. So it's the same in deep tech. You know, we're starting to like, what's going to be not cool in a
Mm-hmm.
year's time that's cool right now. I don't know. This is part of the reason why I ended up going and doing this PhD in STS, because I didn't realize there was this area of study that looked at like the culture
Yeah.
of science and tech, and that's always what I suppose I've been interested in without realizing it. I always sort of shunned this. I couldn't be a sociologist. I would have to, you know, I did a maths degree, so I'm like, oh, I would only do science and tech. And then, you know, suddenly I was like, oh, actually, it's the
You're already
sociology
doing
thing
it.
is what, yeah, exactly. The teams that I think that's what I already do. Maybe I should be a bit more open to the arts and humanities, But anyway, I'm loving, properly looking into it and thinking about it.
Yeah.
I think you share the opinion that there's still a lot to be done in terms of understanding more recent digital tech cultures.
Right.
There's a lot of focus on other kinds of things in STS, but it's a very rich area, and there's a lot to be said, I think, about these people and these places and what they're doing.
Totally. I mean, why don't we transition to that? I mean, I want to tell people, I want them to buy the book. So I'll say that you have a kind of
Thanks.
9-step plan for beating hype in the end, which is somewhat related to the chapters, but I thought they were interesting points, and I'll just say people should check those out. But what are you up to? So first of all, you've also become a parent recently, a mom recently. So
Yes.
you're kind of taking a little break, but what are you
Yes.
thinking about doing in your doctoral work? Do you know what you want to look at yet?
Yeah, so I suppose I have the case study before I had the angle, the research
Yeah,
angle, if that makes
totally.
sense. So I've been really interested in
Mm-hmm.
futurists, specifically corporate futurists, so people who go into businesses. Sometimes they're hired internally, but a lot of the time they're external consultants or they're individuals, freelancers, who go in. Oh, sorry to pause. We have this amazing trap to stop the squirrel from getting the bird seeds, and he's so bloody intelligent. He's like on top of this. He's got all the seeds again. Oh man, he kind of deserves them. Anyway, um, let me just rewind a little bit. Sorry, I get so distracted by the squirrel.
No, it's good.
Yeah, so I've been really interested in corporate futurists,
Mm-hmm.
so people who go into companies and essentially sell information or approaches in terms of thinking about the future. And that can be everything from saying, in 5 years' time, you're going to get this, or this is what the world's going to be like,
Yeah.
to going in and sort of selling methodologies, almost like
Mm-hmm.
consultants. So, using things like the futures cone and things like that to help, or scenario planning, all these sorts of,
Yeah.
I guess, strategies and tools, futurism tools. And I'm very interested in them because I think that there's something contradictory in what they do, because um, as any good STSer will know from their STS 101, the where society and science is co-constructed, and the science impacts society and society impacts science. And so if you are a futurist, arguably you are not just giving information about the future, you are playing a part in creating that
Yeah.
future by giving that information about the future. So there's this kind of creative element to the job. And a lot of the language of futurists is about like desired
Yeah.
futures,
Yeah.
which of course like rings all the bells of the tech
Yeah.
ethicists. Like, well, what do you mean by desired, and who gets to choose, and who's funding this,
Right.
and desired by whom, and all that sort of thing. Um, so there's an element of like, well, yeah, why'd you get to be a futurist? But then there's equally like, why is there even value in
Yeah.
hiring these people? And what does it mean for a company to play a role in deciding the future for society as a
Mm-hmm.
whole? So I was originally really interested in like the ethics of the individuals, of the futurists going into these companies, and how they sort of justify working in a corporate, particularly because a lot of futurists are quite Marxist, a lot of them.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Have these like very sort of social first ideas, but then go and work with a company, and you're kind of like,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
how does that make sense? Um, so I started thinking about that, but I then I've shifted a little bit closer now to the sort of the political economy of
Yeah.
futurists. So how do you become a futurist? How do you get paid as a
Mm-hmm.
futurist? Why do some futurists get paid more than
Mm-hmm.
others? What do you sort of have to say in order to get in the door? Um, what's the sort of community? Because futurism is so interesting. You've got like the academic
Yeah.
futurist, you've got the sort of tech evangelist futurists, you've got the sort of, shall we say, activist futurists.
Right.
You've got ones that are linked to various different social causes. You've got Afrofuturism, indigenous
Yeah.
futures, queer futures, all sorts. Um, And so it's like, what do they all think of each other and how do they all interact is kind of interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's so easy to just go, and capitalism. You know, what's futurism got to do with capitalism? And there's a lot of work and that I've been interested in around sort of the idea of the future being inherent to capitalism. Like you have to have this future facing, you know, the future has to be something that's inherent in your way that you go about things for capitalism to be upheld. So things like credit and competition are both inherently linked to this idea of a conception of the future. So, and again, then you're thinking, well, futurists are hired then to uphold capitalism, which is a little bit grand, and I'm not sure I can do a PhD just claims that. It seems a bit
Well, there's something
simplistic,
to
but
that,
also too complicated.
right?
But yeah, there's some work like Jens Becker, I don't know how to say his name, is kind of the one that writes a lot about it in economic sociology, which I find really interesting. But yeah, I haven't quite decided what I'm trying to add to that conversation. And I think the thing about doing a PhD when you're, you know, a mature student and you're not doing it sort of straight off a master's
Yeah.
or off a undergrad is I'm sort of less interested in getting a PhD as a sort of training program, but I actually want to sort of, sounds diminishing. I don't mean that people don't do PhDs for good reasons, but I think when you're a bit older, it's sort of more about what's the output of the thing you're
Yeah,
really trying to
sure.
say. Particularly when I've also, you know, already had a career, it's kind of what am I trying to add
Mm-hmm.
here? So, but I think a lot of it is about what's this, how is the idea of the future inherently linked with things like technology and capitalism? So, like, why do you need to? So, for instance, futurists that talk a lot about technology are the ones that tend to be more high profile. So,
Yeah.
if you are like a smart city
Yeah, yeah.
futurist, for
Yeah.
instance, you're going to do pretty well versus somebody who's talking about, like, you know, the commons.
Right.
But arguably, that is a very futuristic idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a very historical idea. But the point I'm making is, if you're talking more about social
Yeah.
futures as opposed to tech futures, you're hired in different ways and you have different kinds of value. So why, you know, I suppose that's part of my question. Why is technology so inherent to the idea of the future? Why is the future inseparable to some from a value and capitalism perspective to technology? So maybe I'll try and answer that. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think like, you know, like cancer and food, this is one of these issues that hits us on like a very existential level, because I think especially businesses, but in all parts of our lives, we're all very concerned about the future, which is always uncertain and frightening for that reason, right? We would all like to be able to get our hands around it. In the future's world, they have all this, like, we don't make predictions, we do scenarios, but they're still trying to like help people come up with strategies for coping with the future. But the other thing is just like, I feel like the other side of it is like management. There's a couple of good books on like management faddism and consultants, because the future stuff is so hot right now. But with like a lot of like new fads that take over the management world, it's very hard to judge what efficacy looks like, right? Like beyond like the kind of subjective or on individual and group subjective feeling that like, oh, that was a helpful week-long thing to have gone to, was go to a retreat somewhere really nice and get great food and like dream up science fictional scenarios or something like that. That was useful. Well, beyond like that feeling of usefulness, it's really hard to know how to judge, you know, whether this is a thing that really does help or something. So
yeah, it's really interesting if you look at the kind of literature. So like, you know, the publications in futurism spaces, there's a lot of focus on like essentially how to get the client to do the thing that you've suggested, i.e. how do you make it more effective? How do you justify the cost, and so on and so forth. So there's this real focus on efficacy. And it was something that I kind of got a bit caught up with when I first started. It was like, I'm not really interested in whether or not futurism works. Because I don't, you know, God, that's what do we mean by it working? And there's so many questions around that. But I'm not really interested in that as such. I'm more interested in like the very existence of it and the fact that it's valued,
Right.
which comes back to that point around it's around buying certainty, right? That's what these companies are doing. They're buying a level of confidence in their
Yeah.
actions. Whether that's, investing in this new technology or changing the business structure of this department or whatever, or hiring this person. It's like it's this idea of like being able to justify what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that's particularly interesting in a corporate context, particularly large corporate context, because they're publicly traded and they have to justify
Yeah.
themselves so often. But also, it's very measurable because profit,
Mhm.
right? So, whereas with government, justification for decisions and measurement of decisions is sometimes a lot
Yeah.
more difficult than just sheer did it make money or not. So there's a very, I think, interesting thing there around almost like the fact that futurists exist is kind of like linked to a feeling of trying to get rid of uncertainty and to try not have to frankly take responsibility for your decisions.
Yeah.
In the same way that like consultants,
Right.
like that's what
Yeah,
consulting is for
totally.
business, right? Like, and that's
Mm.
why they make so much. Look at the huge big consultancy companies, right? They make a lot of money on asymmetry of information and corporate CEOs wanting to be able to justify what
Right.
they're doing. So I think futurists kind of play into that in some sense. I don't think they necessarily are deliberately doing that. I don't think that that's what they would say
Right.
they're doing, and I don't think that's it's probably in some sense a offshoot of what they're
Mhm.
doing. It's not primary, but at the same time, I do think that it has a lot of linkage with this kind of. I mean, we see it a lot in kind of datafication of decision making in both in government and in corporates. This idea of you can't do anything unless it's backed by data or data
Yeah.
driven. It has to be objective. It has to be scientific. Which we're also trying to like deconstruct that in the humanities by saying there's no such thing as objectivity, or it's actually decisions are made from various different things. You can't just have data is biased. All these sorts of things are all coming together, and at the same time you've got this idea of like, how do we get certainty, how do we know what we're doing, how do we algorithmic in our decision making, and so on and so forth. So there's a PhD in there somewhere.
Well,
hopefully.
Gemma, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you do with it. I think it's going to be exciting and great. So thank you.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. It's been a lot of fun.
No worries. Thank you for inviting me. And everybody who's listening, you have to go and listen to Lee and Andy's interview that we did on radical science if you want to hear me in the interview seat and Lee being asked all the questions.
Right on.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are supported by the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Fort is the Athenaeum coordinator and digital humanities specialist at VT Libraries, and he serves as producer and sound engineer for the podcast. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.